So, thank you all very much for coming to this presentation. I'm sure you'll find it extremely interesting one. I was going to read out John's kind of bios and achievements. It's so bloody long, I thought, well, you can actually read it. Is that all right with you, John?
That's
fine.
Colleague
of mine, who, perhaps I'm misrepresenting you, described yourself as agnostic about this project in terms of pros or cons. He wants to present the analysis that needs to be seen from his perspective. And I have great pleasure in having all kinds of views on big projects to be discussed and analysed and presented in different ways, and this is part of that mission and agenda. So I'll say no more. We are talking about the politics of the HS2. Let's get this right. High-speed train 2, the project that everyone supports so strongly.
Okay, thanks, Harry. When Harry invited me to give this presentation, I had a couple of misgivings, I'll be honest with you. The first one is that I did a bit of work on HS2 a little while ago, which ended up being involved me in the end, sort of giving evidence to Parliament and getting some media attention for the work that a colleague did. But I haven't done anything recently, so I apologise if for those of you, and I can see one or two people in the audience who've heard me talk about this before, you're not going to necessarily hear that much new about the story of HS2 from me. What I want to do though is think a bit more about some of the political implications of HS2. So that was my first misgiving really about giving this presentation this evening. The second misgiving, which is a much more pressing and important one, is that Sunderland this evening play Arsenal in a crucial, as you will know, end of season game where we need to get a vital point to stay in the Premiership. So I hope you realise the sacrifice I'm making being with you this evening. So let me begin by saying what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to make the case this evening for or against HS2. As I said, I've been involved in some policy and media debates about HS2. And one of the questions you're always asked in a parliamentary committee when you're talking about this topic, or you're interviewed in the media, is are you for or against it? And I always say I'm neither a believer nor a non-believer, I'm agnostic. Okay? In the theology of this argument, I'm an agnostic. I could be persuaded about the case for a high-speed rail, but I haven't yet been persuaded. So that's where I stand on that topic. And I find on this topic, when you're speaking to an audience, it's best to get that out straight away. And it saves you a lot of grief as you go on. What I'd rather do this evening is trace the genealogy, in a Foucauldian sense, for those of you who are interested in that sort of thinking, of the arguments that the particular argument, this is the thing that I want to focus on, the particular argument that HS2 is critical to reshaping the geography, of the economic geography of the UK. I want to trace the growth of this argument as being central to the case of HS2 and to offer some thoughts about why, how, and what that means. It's an idea which grew from a very, very small germ in the debate about HS2 to flower into possibly the central argument in recent times. And it's now very much linked to this notion of the Osborne notion of a northern powerhouse as the means of rebalancing the UK economy, which we've heard so much about recently. So of course there are many different arguments that have been made for HS2 about reducing journey times and the contribution that makes to productivity, the alleviation of congestion, etc. These are all arguments which have been made to support the case for HS2, but I'm not going to get into those kinds of arguments. I'm particularly interested in how we've ended up with the justification for HS2 being that it will regenerate the northern cities. That's my main interest. So what we've seen is a series of separate justifications for HS2 over time, and we seem to have rested recently on this idea that HS2 will have a big impact on regional development. And I think that's worth looking at, because where I sort of entered this debate is by looking at some of the claims which have been made about the regional impact of HS2, and then wondering on what evidence those claims were being made, looking into the official documentation, looking into the analyses produced by DFT, HS2 Limited, and so on, and finding scant evidence on which they based these claims. And so that's how I got involved, for better or for worse, in this debate, pointing out simply that there didn't seem to be a lot of evidence for the claims which were being made, and upon which we were proposing to spend 40, 50, 60, however many billions of pounds it ends up being. My original intention was to link the story of HS2 to debates in planning about mega infrastructure. Because we're hearing the mega infrastructure centre for this evening. And I thought about some of the arguments that our late colleague, Sir Peter Holt, made in his book, Great Planning Disasters. I thought that would be a possible subtitle for this lecture. Or Ben Freiberg's arguments about how we end up developing momentum around mega infrastructure projects. But in the end, I've sought to locate the argument or frame the argument somewhat differently in relation to a different set of arguments which I've drawn from political science and sociology. And the reason I did this was partly because of, and maybe people in the room who have been party to this, that some of us have been caught up in correspondence recently, where some of our academic colleagues wrote a very long letter, drafted a very long letter, calling for a moratorium on HS2. And they circulated to their colleagues and wanted us to sign this letter saying that we were against HS2. And of course, as soon as you do that, the debate explodes into life. Some people say yes, they'll sign it, some people say no, they won't sign it. And I don't know where it's got to. I haven't got involved, basically, because I'm busy. So, but having said that, I thought what was really interesting was reading one of the pieces of correspondence in this exchange, which came from a very senior, very eminent, let's say grandee, if you like, of the world of transport economics. I won't name it because I haven't got his permission to do that. But what he said, Chatham House rules, what he said was quite interesting. He says, thanks, but I won't be signing your letter to the authors of the letter. It's all too late, he says. There's too much cross-party support, there's been consultation, there's been debate, it's been approved by Parliament. I accept that it's a political decision and the arguments have not always been founded on evidence, he says. However, there's been due process, Parliament's approved this. I sympathise with many of the points you make, he says, to these authors who are criticising the project. But I'm not going to sign your letter because it's not worth the effort, really. It's all too late. That's the opening sentence. It's all too late. So how did we get to this point where this grandee, this important, influential figure in transport policy in the UK says, yeah, you've got a point, a lot of the evidence doesn't exist for this project, but we're going to go ahead with it anyway, so I'm not going to speak up against it. I thought that's an interesting, as they say in the Church of England, let that be our lesson for the day. I speak as a good Catholic. Right, so that's where I start from. So my presentation then, my presentation is going to look something like this. I first want to just introduce an idea which I've taken from a political scientist, sociologist. This notion that we're living increasingly in a post-democratic age. We're living in an age where we have the appearance of democracy, where there are democratic institutions, parliaments, and so on. But increasingly, they are remote, separated from the citizenry, and they make decisions according to criteria which are difficult for the citizenry to understand. So I want to just set that argument up very briefly. I don't want to dwell too much on it or get into it in too much detail, but it's just a way that I find out thinking about where we are and then provides a framework for thinking about railways. So I want to talk a little bit about how railways get built, as far as I understand it historically, and then look at HS2 as a modern example, an example of how railways get built in a post-democratic age. So I want to tell the story of HS2, highlight what I've already stressed, the shifting case that's been made for it, the way in which the case for HS2 has evolved over time, away from the original suppositions to this more recent one. Look at what the believers and non-believers say about HS2, and of course some people have shifted from one category to the other and so on. And then look specifically at this issue about HS2 and regional development before reflecting a little bit on where we are in terms of the politics of HS2. I want to begin with this idea of the parabola of democracy. It's taken from a small but brilliant book, which is now quite old actually, well, over 10 years old, by Colin Crouch, formerly of Warwick University and the EUI in Florence, who talks about the parabola of democracy. He argues that we can think about democracy, we can think about the growth of democracy in relation to two criteria. First of all, in relation to time, and also in relation to the degree of democracy, the degree to which the citizen, either individually or organised collectively, can influence the decisions in relation to public policy. And he argues that we experience democracy as a parabola. Over time we see the growth in democracy in the UK from the end of the 19th century through to a kind of high point. Well, we start with a pre-democratic age, and we move from that pre-democratic age where the citizen has very little or no rights at all, towards what he calls a democratic moment. From the late 19th and through the early 20th century, we see the extension of democratic rights and the extension of the right of the citizen to organise themselves politically, in political parties and trade unions and so on, till we reach what he calls the democratic moment. And in the UK context, he would say that was 1945. And why was that important in 1945? Well, that was the key moment where, in particular, the citizen, particularly working class citizens, had their maximum effect on public policy outcomes. Why was that? Because they were organised. They were organised into mass political parties, they were organised into associations like trade unions on a large scale, and there were vehicles for them to participate in, imperfect vehicles, but vehicles for them to participate in decision making. So he calls this the democratic moment. And the democratic moment produced a particular social outcome, the welfare state, the nationalisation of industry, and a movement towards a greater social equality. We're now, he argues, moving in another direction, the direction of post-democracy. We still have all the apparatus of a democratic society. We still have parliaments, we still have political parties, we still have trade unions. They're not unimportant, but their importance in relation to the larger citizen is diminishing. There's less and less contact between the individual citizen and the public policy process, by and large, he argues. I think this is a really interesting argument, because I think it intuitively corresponds with the way we think about the way our society is organised today. It's a tendency, it's not a state that we reach, it's a tendency, it's a line of travel. Post-democratic society is one that continues to have and to use all the institutions of democracy, according to Crouch, but increasingly they become a formal shell. The energy and innovative drive pass away from the democratic arena into the small circles of political economic elite. And I think that we all ought to see some truth in that statement. Because that's the framework within which I started to think about HS2. It's a product of this post-democratic age. Railways, of course, were produced in the democratic age and the pre-democratic age. If we think about the early history of railways and we think about the emergence of them in the middle of the 19th century, that was the moment that we were starting to move in the direction of a democratic age, but Britain was certainly a pre-democratic society, arguably even after the Great Reform Act. If we want a classic example or a classic statement or analysis of the emergence of the railway age during this period, we would read Dickens' Dombey and Son. Okay, so this is the age when railways in Britain were essentially built. And if we think about, we just cross the road and head up towards Camden, this was what we would have seen in the middle of the 19th century, the building of a new railway, which involved tremendous disruption, loss of rights, loss of property, loss of income for all kinds of people. Others were gaining from this, some were gaining from this process, some were not, and that's the process to some extent described by Dickens in Dombey and Son. And of course Britain's benefited from the existence of these railways, so that's a good thing, isn't it? And of course, if there was no cost-benefit analysis used to develop all of this, there was no weighing of the evidence, there was no evidence-based policy which built the railway line from Euston to Birmingham. It was enterprise, it was the thrust of 19th century capitalism which produced this. And indeed, of course, if we think about the great railway engineer of the 19th century, Brunel, speaking at the chairman of the Great Western Railway Company, in his epitaph on Brunel, argues the commercial world thought him extravagant, but although he was great things are not done by those who sit down and count the cost of every thought and act. And in a sense, we could say that's true about HS2. If we if we compare the building of HS2 to the building of the Great Western Railway by Brunel, you can sit there and weigh the arguments, just got on and did it, and we changed the world. And we're all still using the Great Western Railway, so what's the problem? Why don't we just adopt this attitude in relation to HS2? It's one way of thinking about it. Well, it all ended rather badly if we think about it. This is the nationalisation of the railways in 1947 in the UK, and the Great Western Railway, which was built obviously by Brunel. Here we see the logo of it being spread out in the railway yards in Paddington, because the state had to intervene to take control of the railway system, which had grown up in a chaotic and unmanaged and unplanned way in the 19th century. And so this approach, which produced the railways in the 19th century, also produced alongside it a series of very large political and economic problems, which this democratic moment of 1945 was confronted with, and where we see important political action taken to deal with this problem. So, John McDermott, always worth a read, I think, in the Financial Times about anything to do with public policy, argues that we're confronted with two approaches to these problems. One is to see HS2 as a great visionary gamble for the country, but on the other hand, how do we measure that against the empirical case about its impacts? We live in an age where these kinds of arguments have become more important. And if an exponent of HS2, Lord Heseltine, would argue that, again, we didn't do a cross-benefit analysis on Canary Wharf, but what a fantastic thing it's turned out to be. So is that the way in which we should think about HS2? And indeed, what the point, why do we think in these terms in an age where we might consider evidence? So the production of HS2, as we know, I'm not going to read through all of this, the production of HS2, as we know, has been a lengthy one. There's been all kinds of arguments made about the case for HS2, perhaps arguably the biggest transport study that was done in recent times in the UK by Eddington, was quite sceptical. Was quite sceptical about whether investment in a high-speed rail line was worthwhile, whether the costs, whether the benefits rather outweighed the costs. Quite sceptical about it all. Nevertheless, what we see is, despite all of these, despite the evidence of Eddington, a kind of momentum building throughout the 2000s towards this idea that HS2 represented some kind of important solution to a problem. Although it was never quite clear what the problem was that HS2 was a solution to. We're now reaching the point where royal assent is being sought for the hybrid bill going through Parliament, and we're on a timeline which is going to lead us to the building of HS2 and the rolling out of the phase 2, which would take us to Manchester and Leeds by the 2030s, or possibly even sooner, because the momentum is developed around all of this. At the beginning of this process, what was critical to the argument was that HS2 would produce journey savings, journey time savings, and this was central to the case for HS2. The argument being that journey time savings would have positive productivity impacts, and that would benefit the economy as a whole. And that was the first argument which was used during this period. And so the idea was that by reducing journey times, particularly between Birmingham and London in the first instance, and then Manchester and Leeds in the second instance, somehow this would generate productivity advantages for the whole economy. A lot of scepticism emerged around that idea, not enough to stop the process. But what happened in relation to this argument was that arguments began to emerge in places like Birmingham and Leeds, but particularly Manchester, that the building of HS2 would generate important local impacts. And what was in the mind of local planners was this idea that elsewhere in Europe, the building of high-speed rail lines had kind of a local impact in cities such as Lille in this particular case, whereby the arrival of the railway had contributed to urban regeneration around railway stations. And that idea began to take hold, particularly in policy in Manchester and Leeds, in Birmingham and Leeds, but particularly in Manchester. And so it began to be the emergence of this idea that somehow HS2 might contribute to rebalancing the national economy. It was, of course, that all this does is highlight regional differences in the way in which cities and regions respond to the possibility of HS2. So we get the emergence in the south of England of very strong political opposition, which you see if you go to those places in the Chilterns, which the railway is going to go through. You see these, I haven't been there very recently, but you used to see many of these signs opposing HS2, where the line is going to be driven through places like Wendover, for instance, where there's a tremendous amount of opposition illustrated on this figure here, which happens to be in French, but all of these marks, these stars on the map, indicate where there are local opposition groups to the building of HS2. So on the one hand, you get the North's kind of the emergence of a North voice saying this could be good for the North, but a strong opposition to it in the South. And of course, there's a very strong political dimension to this because of the nature of our political geography. The northern places, which are starting to say, by and large, this is a good thing, are Labour-controlled, and the places which, by and large, say it's going to be a bad thing, are Conservative-controlled. So there's this complex north-south economic and political divide emerging around the case for HS2. Just as evidence of this, you know, this is an article from the Telegraph, obviously the house paper of Southern conservatism, which claims that gay marriage in HS2 is undermining support for the Tories in the south of England. Certainly, you know, UKIP made a very big play out of their opposition to HS2. Probably, I don't know whether they oppose gay marriage as well, but certainly they oppose, I don't know whether they do, but certainly oppose HS2. So there's this sense then that there's a north-south political divide emerging, which had potential problems with Conservatives. And it's in this kind of context that you suddenly get Conservative ministers starting to take up this argument that HS2 could play this role of rebalancing the UK economy, a once-in-a-generation chance to reshape our economic geography, tackling the north-south divide through transport infrastructure. These are comments made by, in a speech by Philip Hammond. Careful reading of that speech reveals that it provides not a shred of evidence for any of these claims. not a morsel of evidence, none whatsoever. And if you delve into the associated Department of Transport's documents, again, you will look long and hard for any evidence to support any of this conjecture. And then what we get is this. Then what we get is this sort of assertion of a kind of northern militancy in support of HS2. We have on the one hand the dissatisfaction among natural conservative supporters in the south around all of this, but Manchester City Council commissioning advertising which presents southern Tory toffs in their mansions, preventing the regeneration of Manchester. And these were on buses in Manchester a couple of years ago. So there's this idea then that there's a kind of a north-south politics emerging, which is starting to get a bit aggressive, actually, and possibly a little unnecessary. So this argument that HS2 could contribute to the rebalancing of the UK economy started to gain momentum with this strange alliance between Conservative ministers and Northern Labour council leaders. And that's very important to understand the politics of HS2 and why we've got to where we've got. But very quickly, what happened was that organisations such as the National Audit Office began to say, hang on a minute, you haven't provided any evidence for any of the claims that you're making here. On the contrary, the argument started there started to be an airing of the argument that this high-speed rail line could actually work much more to the benefit of London than the northern cities. So HS2 Limited, it says, has commissioned work to understand the likely impacts of high-speed 2 on regional economic growth. So the argument had been made, and now the search was on for evidence to support it. Right? This is not evidence-based policy. This is policy-based evidence. We have our answer. Now we need some evidence. And the push to HS2, as we all know, occurred really at the fag end of the Brown government in the aftermath of the economic crisis, when a decision was made to commit the UK government to this policy. But in the aftermath of this emerging sense that maybe the argument in favour of rebalancing wasn't all that clear, we start to get some of the people, such as Peter Mandelson, who'd been the strong proponents of the argument for HS2 prior to 2010, changing their mind and arguing that this is going to benefit the South more than the North, and there's the potential to end up as a mistake, damaging the people it was intended to help. The former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Alistair Darling, posed the, I think, rather pertinent question. If you gave England's biggest cities £10 billion each, so you shared the 50 billion that it's going to cost, and said you can each have £10 billion each for economic development, would you spend it on HS2? And I've posed this question myself to, for instance, the North East Chamber of Commerce. You know, if I had £10 billion in my pocket today, and we could spend it, and the target was regional development, would you spend it on HS2? And I said, well, I wouldn't. You would spend it on skills, on education, on schools, because that's what drives economic development, and they know that, but that's where we are. Good question, Alistair. So, in this kind of context, then David Cameron and Osborne, who committed themselves to this project, which they inherited from Labour, announced a fight back. So Twitter storm was created, #HS2, fight back. Begins today, he says, with Transport Secretary Patrick McLaughlin highlighting the huge benefits to the UK and our economy. Huge benefits. Well, McLaughlin shortly afterwards announces that HS2's doubters and defeatists are risking Britain's future. Strong words. George Osborne announces he's passionate about the project. Everybody has to be passionate these days, don't they, about everything? Indeed, the Prime Minister announces that he's passionate about it as well. So I'm sorry for reducing so much passion into the room, but I'd like you all to stay calm. But they're all passionate about it. So this is the fight back, accompanied by an editorial, for instance, in The Sun and many other newspapers. And this seems to me the key sentence from what was not a lengthy editorial, obviously. Britain needs a project on a grand scale. That was the central argument. Not that it's going to rebalance, not that it's going to do anything. We just need an infrastructure project on a grand scale. And none of these seem to me like very good arguments for spending £60 billion. We might need an infrastructure project on a grand scale, but why this one? So it's in this kind of context, and it's a crucial element of the fight back, that this document was produced. High Speed to Regional Economic Impacts. A piece of work commissioned from KPMG to demonstrate the regional impacts of HS2. For a couple of days, you were seeing these kinds of maps appearing in the newspapers. This one's from Financial Times, showing that everybody's going to do. It's going to be great. Everybody's going to benefit. Although some places, in absolute terms, more than others. So the KPMG study elaborately produce a set of elaborate econometrics to justify this argument that HS2 is going to have all these positive regional impacts. But not even a close reading, a scan through the document produces this statement. The methodology employed to produce these results makes the implicit assumption that transport connectivity is the only supply-side constraint to business location. In practice, there could be other constraints that could inhibit the potential location effects, such as the availability of skilled labour and land in a given location. So essentially what it's saying is we could build this, but unless there are skilled people and adequate premises in these places, their own analysis assumes that all of their predictions could be wrong. Okay, so what's essential is to create an environment, what's essential is to create complementary changes to affect an environment in which businesses could develop. This is not really evidence that HS2 is going to have any impact on regional development, in my view. And also indeed in the view of other people, so the government's own advisors say, well, it's a flawed study. HS2 expert, I'm not sure who this was, probably Henry Oldman. Yes, it is Henry Oldman at LSE. Says, as Henry usually says, your maths is wrong. But he's usually right when he says that. To be fair. So this fight back, based around presenting HS2 being concerned with regional development, falls apart. And it's at this point that we see the Labour Party, in this case Ed Balls, graphically presented for us by Steve Bell in The Guardian, saying that he's not sure about HS2. He's not sure anymore about HS2 because HS2 is potentially very expensive. It's potentially not going to have the impact that the government says. So he breaks the consensus at the Labour Party's conference in Brighton in 1913. And there we have it. So, Cameron has to respond to this. I don't believe in the end Labour will go wobbly on it because they'll be turning their backs on England. What's the evidence for this? Well, the evidence is presented by Sir Richard Leese, the leader of Manchester City Council, who strangely, arguably, or unexpectedly perhaps, emerges as a strong ally of the Prime Minister against Ed Balls in the promotion of HS2, which he thinks will have a positive impact in Manchester. So there we have it. It's a strange set of political bedfellows. But here we see the beginnings of all of this Northern Powerhouse discussion which is going on at the moment, and the relationship between Manchester and Osborne and Canberra growing. The government appointed an HS2 task force to address this point that KPMG makes about we need to understand the wider context within which HS2 can act as a local catalyst for development. So that was established. And we see that many of the people who were on this task force include Howard Bernstein, the CEO of Manchester City Council, Albert Ball, the leader of Birmingham Council, leader of Sheffield Council, leader of Trafford Council. So we have this alliance here between big construction companies like Lionel Roque, the Treasury, and northern cities, essentially, around this building case for HS2. This is how the politics plays out. Pete Waterman, for those of you of a certain vintage will know, record producer of the 80s, famous for promoting Kylie, etc. Even he comes out and predicts it will be a smash hit. And what's the significance of this? The significance of this is that suddenly the newspapers are full of these kinds of articles. This is a particularly egregious example of trying to build a case for HS2. He's a model train enthusiast, and that's apparently his qualification for contributing to this debate. But the point is that some kind of big propaganda media blitz is taking place here. And Steve Bell again often captures the mood in relation to all this. So a big effort, fight back, as the Prime Minister said, around HS2. But the most interesting thing about all of this is that we find that as this fight back builds up, as this evidence is produced, as these arguments are put forward, we find that the level of support for HS2 systematically falls in opinion polls, and the level of opposition systematically increases. So this is quite interesting. Why is that happening? Part of it is that people just don't believe this story that they're being told. And at the same time, evidence starts to be aired that the kind of implication that, that Manchester and other cities have put out there, that high-speed rail regenerates cities, isn't really borne out by close examination of experiences elsewhere. And I think what we have here is a massive sort of effort to create the evidence in support of this case, which simply isn't believed. We'll skip that one. There's also, of course, efforts to, I'm not suggesting that I support any of these arguments, but there are suggestions by organisations such as the New Economics Foundation and others, that there are other ways we could spend this money and achieve similar objectives. So the New Economics Foundation argues that you could spend the sorts of money which is proposed to be spent on HS2 on a series of much more modest transport initiatives, which potentially have even bigger impacts, measured by very conventional benefit-cost ratio techniques. There are suggestions that you could have other railway lines. I'm not saying I support any of these things, I'm just saying that there's a suggestion that alternatives have not been properly considered. So we get this problem where newspapers like the Financial Times argue that there's evidence from a range of other countries that the main beneficiaries of high-speed rail lines tend to be the largest hubs on the route, which in this case was London. So this counter-evidence starts to get a hearing in places like the FT, The Economist, dodgy assumptions. Why are we going on with this, though? I mean, this is the really interesting thing. The Economist says, yes, the arguments don't really stack up here, but don't expect this to stop the momentum in the direction of HS2. And this is a very telling headline, isn't it, from The Economist. Why growing resistance to HS2 will probably not prevent it being built. Okay, so there's this apparent crumbling of the case, this attempt to remake the case. No one's convinced by this case, especially as far as the regional economic development aspects are concerned. But a weighty newspaper like The Economist saying, don't expect this to don't expect this to stop the policy. So what's going on here? And where did the fight back come from? And what were its origins and what were its impacts? Well, it's worth having a look at an organisation like Westport Communications, a company which was employed by HS2 Limited, which sees its role as changing opinion. And on their website, they have a little case study of their policy successes, a set of case studies of their policy successes, and one of them concerns HS2, in which they announced that they were given the challenge of basically making the case for HS2 in a context where ministers and civil servants were legally constrained. Okay? It's interesting, isn't it? And so their activities were, they started a rebuttal operation, they mobilised stakeholders, they launched a press operation, worked with MPs in a new all-party parliamentary group. A lot of sins are committed in all-party parliamentary groups. So there, this effort to try and change opinion using these kind of very interesting techniques, possibly well-worn techniques by now. The results they claim are that HS2 now has a well-organised support system. They've pressed the reset button, and a potentially critical parliamentary select committee on transport on HS2, which I gave evidence to, is largely supported following formal evidence. So this is their, they argue that they've had these very successful impacts. A lot of what they did was actually outside of London in newspapers like the Yorkshire Post and the Manchester Evening News and on social media and so on, but at the same time trying to influence the big programmes such as Newsnight, which I also contributed to. The idea was that this was all going to change the story around HS2. One of the most interesting things that happened during this period was a letter going to the FT from a range of businesses, to the Telegraph, I beg your pardon, which, from a range of businesses, Arthur Beattie, Atkins, McDonald Arup, and Kia, making the case that HS2 is a much-needed investment in infrastructure in the future. So we have the biggest British engineering companies, all of which, of course, potentially gain from £50 billion expenditure on a new railway line, as part of this news effort. Now, the results hardly go really representative of pressing of the reset button, because as we've seen, as all of this was going on, opinion was actually moving against HS2. What happens here is that, according to John Kay in the FT, what we have is the production of something which he argues does not merit the title of research, sham models and consultations, to produce an outcome which gives the appearance of due process. So go back to that statement I made at the beginning about my esteemed colleague who argued there has been due process. Kay says, no, there hasn't. There's been the appearance of it. Right? There's been the appearance of it. Very powerful forces have created an argument which is being endorsed by Parliament, but this is not due process, and it's not a proper argument. Okay? So where are we left in this story? We're left then with a situation where, despite the building of this case for HS2, and despite the growing centrality of to the argument that it's going to reshape the economic geography of the UK, and that being critical to the Prime Minister's fight back on HS2, a coach and horse is essentially being driven through the economic arguments on all of that. But nevertheless, the outcome is, as we stand, we're going ahead with HS2. So this brings me back to the open discussion about post-democratic politics. This notion that we have the appearance of debate, we have the formal structures for debate about these things, but in the end, they count for nothing against the very powerful vested interests that are organised around a project like this. Now, it may be that HS2 will have a tremendously beneficial impact, but I'm sure we'll see some new buildings go up around stations in Manchester and Leeds. That's a given. And that will be offered as evidence of the successful impact of HS2. But we know that that's not a very convincing case, and there are all kinds of reasons to suspect that that case will look very weak. Nevertheless, by that point, we would have spent 50 or 60 billion pounds on this policy. And a lot of vested interests will gain tremendous benefits from that. Whether we rebalance the UK economy is an entirely separate issue altogether. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, John. We'll take questions, comments. Please, we won't ask you all to introduce yourselves as I usually do, because it's too large a number. But please mention your name and where you're from when you ask the question. Thank you.
Richard Wellings from the IEA. I wondered what you thought the reasons were for the Conservative leadership support for HS2, given it seems to go against their ideology between a strong project, taxpayer funding, etc. I think initially it was partly to do with a sort of both alternative to Heathrow expansion. But now they're saying that that's probably going to go ahead anyway. How do you explain the sort of retention of this support?
I can't explain it. Beyond the fact that, clearly, if you look back at some of those very large companies, some of which have very close relationships with the Conservative Party, I mean, I might point you there as a place to have a look and for an explanation. I don't know really what's going on there. But I agree with you. It doesn't really fit in some sense, or it didn't. Where it fits now is that it fits very neatly into this story of Northern Powerhouse, which is admittedly a very vague and again, some evidence-free sort of notion in many ways, but it's politically useful, I think, the Northern Powerhouse story for a part which we've seen it has its electoral support concentrated largely in the south of England. Even in the last election, it's made very little inroads into the north of England. Possibly something in all that, some pragmatic decisions were made. But I can't really explain it until you get George Osborne here to give a presentation. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to do that. And coming from the IEA, you probably much closer to what goes on in the Conservative Party than I am.
Can I just add, I think the only other explanation I've heard is that they're not really conservatives, they're actually neo-conservatives, and for neocons, social cohesion is very important, the idea of bringing sort of one nation together, making part of that involved.
Yeah, and you may be right about that.
Yeah.
Dorothea Hackman, local opposition to HS2. In your analysis, where you have Northern Labour Party, Southern Tory, how was the pro-High Speed to Hammersmith Labour, anti-High Speed to Camden Labour dynamic work? And where do you rate the argument of levelling the community of Houston, creating a flat 17 football field size redevelopment is the real attraction for the capitalist developers?
I've got nothing to say about the war between Hammersmith and Camden on HS2. I don't know, again, why we get those arguments. I'm sure they have their reasons. But as far as the redevelopment around Houston is concerned, I think it should be understood that whatever the advantages and disadvantages of HS2, and there will be some advantages which will arise, there will be some benefits. But whatever the balance of those, it should be understood that HS2 is not a policy of social redistribution. People who are going to be using HS2 are largely high-income people. It's going to be an expensive technology. And in the production of that, there will be costs, there will be losers. There will be losers in Leeds and Manchester. Even if you build a big station and there are lots of benefits associated from that, there will be some groups who will lose out. In the places around Curzon Street and so on in Birmingham, the same things will happen. So how do I rate that argument? I mean, if you're going to have if you're going to have a high-speed rail station on the European model, you're going to see a lot of demolition and rebuilding, because that's essentially what happens. Except if you build these stations on the outskirts of cities like Nottingham and places like that, or you can see in the case of Lille it has caused some regeneration. But in the case of London, you're building a railway station in what is already a highly developed and congested space just over the road there. So there will be a lot of social costs associated with that. It seems to me just obvious, really.
Yes. Yes.
I know that.
Can you just tell me where you're from? And
Sorry, Richard Smith. I feel like I've been reading about this kind of thing that HS2 for quite a few years. I've read quite a lot of the railway press for a lot of years. And I think maybe there's an aspect to look into kind of before it came on the cards, because I know Lord Adonis, Andrew Adonis, introduced it about 2009 quite prominently. But I do remember there were quite a few years when if you went to Treasury with an idea like this, you'd be laughed off the table. It just wasn't considered. I mean, investment in railways really only started to pick up maybe with the Jubilee line, but even then that's quite early on. And it's interesting that we've now gone to a situation where there's a lot of support from it on a cross-party basis, and I think it's part of a wider thing to do with railways. But almost the kind of counterpart argument to why has this got so much support now is the argument of why didn't it have so much support before 2009, irrespective of whether or not the argument is kind of sound underneath it. It's quite an interesting, might be an interesting framework to look at. What do you think about it?
Yeah, that is a fair point. What Mandelson says is that in the aftermath of the economic crisis and the collapse of the kind of new Labour narrative, this is more or less what he says. He said it a bit in newspapers, but he said it more sort of in speeches that or contributions that I've heard him make. He argues that we were short of big ideas, and this was a handy one, and so we thought we'll go for it. It allows us to say something. It allows us to appear to be having a big offer to make in the 2010 election. It's something that appeared, at that time there was already this sense that it could have regional development impacts, and they needed a story which looked as if something was going to come out of the election for their own supporters in the north. So I think that was part of what went on there, particularly in the context of the economic crisis. They were short of a story which made it look as if they had a narrative about all of this, about UK economic development, essentially. But he admits that we didn't think any of this through properly. He's more or less honest about that, I think, and as is Darwin. I take your point. It is probably worth thinking more about this. There's a lot more you could do in all of this.
name and institution, please.
Tim Stockton from Camden Westland. The arguments for the opportunity cost, to me, are very persuasive. This is 50 billion minimum on a 19th century technology. Nothing really new about it, compared to all the things you could do with education, umpteen alternatives. Why do you think opportunity cost hasn't really gained any traction as an argument?
I think that one of the problems was that the opposition to HS2 allowed itself to be presented very early on as NIMBY. And you listen to people like Sir Richard Leese from Manchester saying, why should wealthy southern homeowners in the leafy valleys of the Chilterns stop the regeneration of the north? These people are just NIMBYs, and you see that in those posters that they inadvertently had on the buses in Manchester. And I think that's one of the problems, that there wasn't an alternative case to be being made, which was more positive, which was that, there's a lot of money here, could we use it wisely and better? So the New Economic Foundation tried to do some of that, but it's a nice infographic, but the actual analysis behind all of that isn't very profound. So I think that there was a sort of idea, an intellectual gap. Right? And you could say that academics like me, who were sceptical about all of this, should have done more to try and make this case a lot sooner than we did. I think that's one of the points which is being made in some of the discussion, the email discussion that I mentioned earlier on. It's far too late for you academics now to be saying this is a bad idea. You should have made this case much more strongly earlier on, and explained how the money could be better used elsewhere. But I think what you have is a set of very powerful resources which can be put into play in the media and so on, which are very difficult to to make that argument against. And you know, just as a rider to that, in my exchange with the Transport Select Committee on that HS2 report, one of the Conservative MPs on the committee, Kwasi Kwarteng, actually said directly to me, I've spoken to plenty of businessmen in Manchester and they think it's a brilliant idea. Why should I listen to you? You've never run a business. And that was his argument. To which I said, well, I confess I've never run a business, but what I have done is present you with some evidence. You know, if you prefer to spend £50 billion on the basis of some discussions with business people in Manchester, then that's fine. But there isn't any evidence that what you're going to do is going to have these impacts. But that's where you are.
Hi, I just wondered.
Good name and affiliation.
Not Denson.
From?
No.
You don't have to have it.
I just wondered, the Northern Powerhouse, obviously, they're now looking at the links across the north, east-west links. Could that become more important than HS2? Would that be more beneficial to spend the money on those links than a fast track to London?
Well, it's interesting that one of the things which has been produced and which is part of the intellectual underpin of the Northern Powerhouse, the Manchester Independent Economic Review, which was a major piece of work which is really sort of underpinned the case which Manchester has made for the sort of devolution which Manchester is now getting in terms of both powers to act and resources to act with. And the Manchester Independent Economic Review has quite a nice little study of transport policy as part of it, actually conducted by people at LSE, in which they argue that by far the greatest weight of evidence, to the extent that there is evidence, and I think this is borne out by lots of other pieces of economic analysis, by far the greatest weight of evidence is that improving intra-regional transport links will have bigger impacts on productivity because of the role that they play in creating agglomeration economies, or underpinning agglomeration economies, than will building something like HS2. Eddington made a very similar point back in 2006 before all of this started. So my answer to your question is probably yes. Now, though, this idea of HS3, which was put forward, and it is only that, no one's ever actually costed it or actually explained what it would look like. And again, Sir Peter Hall had a few interesting things to say about it last year. We don't really know what that's going to amount to, but it's probably going to be absolutely necessary for there to be a chance of any kind of gains arising from HS2, net gains arising from HS2 for places like Manchester. But those kind of infrastructures will benefit Manchester much more than they will benefit the rest of the north. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind in relation to this.
Hi, I'm from I mean, it's interesting that the Lord's report, that's been published in March, was highly critical. And they've done a much more scrutiny, much deeper than Commons. I sort of come from the north just about.
Where's that?
Well, my family's in Manchester.
Oh, that counts.
It counts, okay. And I feel that it's a huge con on the northern people. However, it doesn't look as if the northern people themselves are con. The local polls that haven't got huge sort of, I don't know, status, but that they don't feel that it's in their best interest either. And then we've got the Northern Powerhouse, which comes only if you are going to have an elected mayor, which was rejected a couple of years ago. So the democratic process has been completely wiped out up there as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, we could have a discussion about the Northern Powerhouse and
Yeah.
legitimacy of it, which is probably not the topic for tonight, but there's actually evidence from the opinion polls which YouGov was doing that levels of opposition to HS2 are higher in the north than the south, which is a bit of but what you have there essentially in Manchester, I would argue, is a sort of political technocratic elite, which is very closely linked to key business interests, particularly in the property sector in Manchester. I've just written something about this, actually, I'll send it to you.
Oh, please do.
Which, you know, which sees some advantage, particularly for Manchester itself, in all of this. Because what we do know is that if, let's say, you spend £1 billion on a railway station in the centre of Manchester, that's going to have an economic impact. That's going to cause some urban regeneration. Whether it's the right kind, or whether it's going to last, or whatever, or whether you could have spent the money better in other ways, it is definitely going to have an impact. And I think that the leadership in Manchester understands that, and that's their strategy.
One thing that I picked up when I was speaking to both people, Conservative voters in the Chilterns, but also Labour voters in the South, and it was just the odd comment here and there. There was this concern with triangulation, that basically, because there is a cross-party consensus, and because that basically both parties are making a political calculation that they can afford to alienate some of their political base with the project funders. But that's a strategy of the two-party system. And as we see, you know, arguably some decline in that two-party system, whether or not that strategy still stands up, and whether or not, as we see politics become more diverse, whether or not the politics of HS2 is likely to change, or whether or not that's likely to have any effect on the politics of HS2.
You know about this than I do, Dan. You've been out and spoke to these community groups, so I agree with you. I think, you know, it's interesting, isn't it, that UKIP made opposition to HS2 one of their blue ribbon policies, and I suspect as well that some of this new intake of Conservative MPs in the 2015 intake are going to have been elected on the basis of a strong anti-planning, anti-development base platform. Case in point is the woman who defeated Ed Balls in Yorkshire. And a central and clearly very compelling part of her platform was an anti-development agenda known as protecting the green belt. So this, I think that you might be onto something there. You know, it could have played out differently in this election, but in the end it hasn't. But we don't really know what the makeup of this new intake of MPs is yet. It might be as well that we don't know what the intake of new Labour MPs is yet, and what their views on all of this are. So the consensus around this might be more fragile than it appears. I don't know. You know, I think it's interesting. You know, your findings on this are interesting.
I'm John Cartridge. I used to work for London Travel. My first question is, where can I get some of that liniment? Like you, I'm naturally agnostic, but I have to say my scepticism about HS2 took a knock when Mandelson came down on that side. You talked about the politics of HS2 at a macro level, and it's promoted with a kind of zealotry, independent of the evidence. I just thought you might be interested to have an example of the same phenomenon in relation to the same project operating at the micro level, because that's the only point at which I've had to engage with the proponents of HS2. You may well be aware that in recent years the European Union has been promoting technical standards for interoperability, common technical standards which all new railway systems have to conform with, which is so that there's a common market in the supply of railway equipment and you can operate trains across frontiers. And after a lot of debate, they agreed on 2 platform heights that would be, one or the other would be the norm everywhere in Europe. Britain has high railway platforms, so there was a special opt-out case allowed in Britain. So Britain has its own unique height, which is different from those that apply everywhere else. But for reasons that nobody can explain, the people who are promoting HS2 decided that they want their trains to have higher floors than any other trains that exist anywhere in Europe. They're going to have big wheels and a floor above the wheel. And they won't put the wheels between the carriages, so the carriages have to be higher than these big wheels. And that means that they'll be 9 inches higher, even than the high British norm, which the rest of Europe has agreed to. Now, they can't do that under the technical standard for interoperability because they don't, none of the exemption criteria apply, like if it's a project that's already underway, or it would be technically infeasible to comply, or whatever. So, unfortunately, civil servants from the Department of Transport are being sent off to Brussels to tell the rest of Europe, the other 27 countries, to tear up their technical standard for interoperability, because HS2 wants a different standard that will be unique to that railway alone, and they're not going to play ball with anybody else. And the interesting thing is that HS2 will only have, depending on what happens at Old Oak, either 4 or 6 platforms, i.e. 2 in London and 2 in Birmingham. Everywhere else it goes, we're using existing platforms. And its trains will be totally incompatible with all those existing platforms. And the rest of the railway industry is up in arms about this because they think it's a total nonsense. But they're not allowed to say anything in public because they're all under contract with the government. And the civil servants who are going to Brussels know that there is no valid case for this at all, but they're being required to do it because HS2 is the flavour of the month, and their political masters have told them. It's an extraordinary perversion of democracy or anything else.
Well, I like to say that I've learned something tonight, so and I bow your superior knowledge about platform rates.
Ben McNamee, Council of I was going to give our report, but just to comment on the political process. I think the timeline was a little out of date now. We're expecting roller sense towards the end of 2016 to be able to build phase 1. It's gone through the House of Commons, but it hasn't gone through the House of Lords yet. So just say it'd be interesting to watch what happens when it does go to House of Lords, given our report for a select committee. It was unusually critical, quite strong language. So it would be interesting to see what happens there. So maybe some more twists and turns.
Yeah, I think the House of Lords is another. You're right. The House of Lords is another place where it can unravel. If I was an opponent of HS2, which I'm not, I'm agnostic, right? But if I was an opponent of HS2, that's where I'd be placing my attention for the next few months.
Roger Woodward, I'm a consultant. As a planner, regional planner, do you have any thoughts as to if you were given HS2 and knowing nothing about it, and just told that it will change relative accessibility in the country in the following way, massively, would it not be possible to come up with some a priori reasoning as to what the impacts might be and where the main impacts might be? I've been rather surprised that the economic regional development arguments revolve around KPMG modelling was unhelpful in the extreme. And there's very little convincing arguments, partly based on what happens in other places, but based on good principles of regional planning that I've seen. And I would have thought that cogent arguments that carried some conviction was necessary in order to support any other numbers that might be produced.
I would probably say my colleague Chen has probably got something to say about that because she and Peter all tried to do some of that. I don't know if you want to say something.
Yeah, I think high speed 2 is a kind of very controversial subject to make the decision, and I would like to highlight in terms of high speed 2 and the regional development. And I'm not as passionate as George Osborne or the leader of the Conservative Party. But I think in terms of the regional impact of high-speed rail is very interesting to every country who are actually investing in high-speed rail. And for my research, I've been doing this for my PhD, and I feel a little bit disappointed. Actually, all these debates has been really similar. People who will still support, regardless any argument or evidence produced. And I think high-speed 2 itself will not reduce the regional inequality. And from my research, I've been highlighted because some country work and some country does not. And some regions work, some regions does not. So my research actually is really trying to understand why somewhere work, somewhere not. In the UK, we have been saying the regional policy is not really very helpful because in the end, you probably produce Manchester and Leeds will not be that different from London, but the hinterland of Manchester will be left behind. And that's what we have been saying, that in terms of intra-regional connectivity, need to be able to connect to these hubs, which produce the high-speed rail in terms of the distance between time between London and these regional cities. So I think the question we are asking probably need to rephrase to like whether high-speed 2 will reduce, or how can we use high-speed 2 to really rebalance the regional inequality. And if we really be able to look at this, even though we have highlighted this in our research, but it's not really been picked up by the politicians. And we still look at high-speed 2 itself, whether it can work. And I think if we keep on looking at high-speed 2 itself, it will not be able to do that. So, yeah, I think regional policy, regional planning is very important to really make work, to make the high-speed 2 really to do something.
Can I add?
Yeah.
If I may. The Omega Centre undertook, many of you know, 13 case studies internationally, mega transport projects, of which incidentally one was the high-speed 1, the CTRL. And the first thing that is not only unacceptable, shaming, is that there was no lessons learned systematically from this international experience, or even the CTRL. We provided Treasury and Public Transport with the lessons. At the time, the argument was, as you presented, travel time saving was king. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. Alas, irrespective of how good the project is. The second point is, the lesson is, very, very clearly, it's how you frame these projects. If you frame them as agents of change with regard to achieving particular visions, then it's a different project to if you have a project that wants to get a certain number of people of a particular kind from A to B at a particular cost. Now, sorry to, but I think it's relevant to share this with you because it relates to a history. So what were the civil servants doing all this time when they had access to this knowledge, and not only our knowledge, but the knowledge of other projects in Europe? Well, you look carefully, and as we actually interacted with them, you go to the Treasury in particular, and who do you find are the civil servants that you're talking to, trying to convince them of a broader approach? Back then, 5 years ago, or whatever it was, they were Pricewaterhouse KPMG secondants to the Treasury. And they, you would argue, be biased perhaps in the way they think, let alone the invested in conflicts of interests. So why has never any of this come up? Now I happen to be I happen to be a supporter of mega projects that have a vision. But as was said to me, and I can't quote his name, he hasn't given me permission to quote it, but in the UK, since that height of democracy that you've shown, if you have a vision, the rats will get at it in the UK. Vision, we don't do vision in the UK. Now, that is absolutely absurd, and mega project successes as all being undemocratically wastes of money is also absurd. If you look at the visions of the National Health Project, you look at the vision of new towns, we are a heritage of mega projects, but we have become victim to a politics which, forgive me, but I think has a New Labour origin as well. We are now victim of a politics of political realpolitik. And what is this realpolitik? We learned from talking to the stakeholders, the investors, the consultants, that from their very words, not ours, the principal purpose of the private sector, which have an increasingly important role to play, is to lock in the government to a project. That's their job. Don't you understand it? Now, if that's their job, and the public sector capability to argue differently is being contracted, the argument against that impulse of lock them in, if you look at the history of big projects, the number of them that have been bailed out by the public sector is huge. So why not lock them in? Because when you lock them in and the finances don't work, you restructure the project, as you did with CTRL 1, and you still make a profit. So, more recently, I don't think there's anything secret about this, we were asked to contribute, again, our inputs from the Omega Centre to Treasury, under the auspices that we were looking at interdependencies. As the travel time saving argument became weak, they were desperately looking for greater rationale, too late to frame the project. And when we presented them, well, you have to frame the project in regional development, national development. We don't do regional. I went to a meeting with Pickles present. We don't use the word regional, remember, even with the Liberal Democrats' secret hand. Regional we don't do. Have you seen the National Plan of Infrastructure? It's a shopping list. They do not understand the vision of national, regional, and I would argue local development. Now, against that backcloth, forgive me for going on, against that backcloth is the power of the logic of the project management, is to get the project done on time within budget, and actually doesn't move the budget because we can pick up the losses later on. And the power of the project management, the Treasury, you know, it really is unfair in a way to civil servants in the British government at the moment. I mean the real ones, not the seconded ones. Because they have been presenting the broader arguments for a long time. What I have learned to my dismay is that these arguments for framing the projects broadly, you can see it in the Big Dig next week, you presented. You can see it in France, Germany, in Switzerland, Sweden. You can see the lessons of framing big projects differently. There's always winners and losers. That has to be understood. But there has been a complete refusal. And what was said to me, and I'll conclude there, to me by a Conservative MP, it is theology, my dear man. Theology. It is. And now, all of a sudden we've discovered regional development. We've discovered the Scots. We've discovered that we need to frame it differently. It's rhetoric. I've told all my students on the MyPay program to buy this book on rhetoric, because we do need to understand. And the difficulty is the rhetoric destroys the concept of mega projects as agents of change for good. You have to think of the good projects that have happened. They're not all bad, but if you frame them from the beginning and you keep on changing, then I suppose the best thing I can suggest, and I'll leave that as a question to you, and maybe in fact, it was my puzzle time today, and I said to him, please, can you persuade your colleague, Mr. Osborne, to have a bit more of a vision? I know George has got vision, he told me. But, well, anyway, I think the best way to go forward here, and I too received a letter, haven't replied, I don't know how to reply, is actually to say, well, let's do a appraisal of this, of how to reframe it in the very concepts that you are advocating. And you're saying this as well, John. You believe in the powerhouse, let's frame it not in travel time savings. Let's not frame it in terms of finishing the project on time within budget. Let's actually frame it in terms of how it contributes to national, local, regional development, and indeed the transnational. And I tell you one last thing, which is shameless. If you believe that these projects, strategic projects, are extremely significant for national development, why do you then bring in foreign investors to have more than 51% control of what you do when you later on privatize it? There are huge problems, but my difficulty is, and I think you are to some degree in the same position, I think the way this has been framed has discredited the civil service in Britain, our politicians, economists, and the way we view big projects. Big projects should not be thrown out the window. You have to use them in certain instances. In the austerity predicament we have in Europe, there is a place. The New Deal in the USA showed that to be the case. But you need to have it towards achieving a particular end. And I think that's what we've lost. And I fear that the man is right. This is theology, and this is not really economics, and it's not rational thinking. But I was wondering what your reaction might be to, because there's a danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but I wonder what your comments were on that. You've got 5 minutes.
Well, I'll have two comments. The first is that academics themselves are implicated in this, whether they admit it or not, and we could be very critical about our own role in allowing these debates to evolve in the way they do without making effective interventions. And it's interesting, that the circulation of this letter does not produce a consensus among the academic community. It actually produces a large amount of dissension. We can't agree with ourselves how to develop a critique of what's going on. And finally, what I'd say is Sunderland Arsenal kicks off in 45 minutes. And important as these topics are, I think it's maybe
Thanks very much. Thank you very much.